Former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society. From messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted throughout our culture, Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him are groundbreaking artist and podcaster Jacqueline Clare, whose focus on spiritual realism is summarized by the quote, "When we don't take the high road with our choices and miss the opportunity to develop spiritual qualities, we literally forfeit the purpose of our lives." And Jill Surek, a conservative non-denominational Christian and registered nurse who moved her family from Wisconsin to Florida in carefully navigating this nation's rapidly changing child education and healthcare systems. Former minister and founder of
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Created in the Image of God, where we explore the role of religion in society. And today we will be asking the question, can people Christ back? And we will be exploring this with our Eileen. So in Haifa, Israel, where he assisted with historical restoration at the Baha'i World Center. Jay has a passion for religious history and prophecy and is the author of the historical novel, The Wise Men of the West. And we're very excited to explore this question of, can we put Christ back into Christmas, with our guests. So let's bring our guests up to the table. Hi, Jay, and hi, Eileen.
Hello.
Hey there. So I'd like to let the audience get to know you a little bit and start with your upbringing, sort of a nutshell of the experiences and the circumstances that you see now as very formative, that really shaped the path you ended up on and who you are today. So basically, like, first 14 years of your life, those powerful influences and experiences. So Eileen, I'll let you start.
Okay. Excuse me. You're asking what were the formative pages of my life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh my gracious.
The nutshell.
Oh my, this is getting better and better. Well, it sort of goes like this. As far as Christmas goes, I grew up with Christmas and I have absolutely wonderful memories of it because all us kids saved our money. And at a week before Christmas, we counted it out. We all went Christmas shopping and we wrapped our presents. And my mother was very, very good on Christmas Day about having us pass out the presents one at a time so everybody could see who got what. So I have wonderful memories of Christmas. As for the rest of my life, the first half of my life was not very good. There's a lot of pain and trauma connected with it. The second half of my life started when I became a Baha'i in my mid-40s. But actually being a Baha'i gave me a much better understanding of Jesus and appreciation for who he was and what he did.
Very nice. So were you raised in the church or just more culturally
Yes.
Christian?
No, my mother had come out of fundamentalist Christianity to middle of the road, and we were raised in a Universalist church, which would be considered liberal these days.
Okay. And Jay, what about you? Formative experiences that sort of set the stage for who you are today?
So I was raised outside of Detroit, suburb of Detroit. My family was Presbyterian, and I attended Sunday school regularly. And I remember hearing the stories of Noah, and then of Abraham, Moses, and then Jesus. And I remember thinking, even back as a child, why was it that God seemed to speak to us on a regular basis? And now for the last 2,000 years, we haven't heard from him. So this was a question that was, I guess, in my mind from, fairly early stage. And of course, when I heard about the Baha'i Faith, that naturally, answered that initial question. So I started to look into it. I became a Baha'i when I was almost 16, so I was still in high school, and have been a Baha'i now for over 50 years.
Wow. Well, the next question I wanted to ask you guys revolves around this theme of personal responsibility, whether it was something people were raised with or they chose to take it on at some point in life. Basically, where you voluntarily take on agency, for making the world a better place or changing the course of your life. So I would like to hear from you guys the theme of personal responsibility. And it sounds like for you, both of you, it might have something to do with you finding the Baha'i Faith, like these were pivotal changes in your life. But just however you want to answer the question, as far as your awakening to personal responsibility and just what that means to you now and what it looked to you when you started to become an adult and take ownership for your own agency in this life. I hope that's not too broad. Eileen, do you have something to respond to that?
Yes, it is too broad. I would substitute the word responsibility for service. Okay. Because the Baha'i Faith is all about service. And that's why I served at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel for 16 years. It was service. And that's why I have been immersed since my retirement, which turned out not to be much of a retirement at all. I have been immersed in my writing, which is another form of service, because I feel that I'm writing about topics that are very important that no one else has written about.
So, Eileen, I feel like different audience members from different backgrounds might have different understandings of that word service. Can you share what it means to you in this context?
Well, to serve means you don't expect anything in return. You don't do it for money. We were not on salary at the World Center, although our needs were taken care of. To serve means that you do it from your heart, and you expect nothing in return. It's out there, and then it's gone. You've done it, but you're not building up any brownie points.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And Jay, my overly broad question about taking on personal responsibility, which I'm piecing some parts together here, but it sounds like if you chose a religion at 16, there was definitely a degree of agency with that choice. So just, your development with personal responsibility and what it means to you today.
Yeah, well, I think as I was thinking about career choices, I was thinking, how can I use my skills in particular? I seemed to have, when I was young, a strong suit in mathematics and science. So I went into the field of engineering. The Baha'is had a need for what they call pioneers. These are people who will travel to another country and help with the development of the Baha'i Faith, but not as employees. We don't have missionaries as such. So there were a lot of countries that needed civil engineers. So it seemed like a good fit. I was able to use my civil engineering skills to help with road construction while we lived in Liberia, West Africa, for 4 years. And in my spare times, the evenings and weekends, we could help with the development of the Baha'i community in various ways. And just so happened, after we came back, that we saw a position that the Baha'i World Center actually needed a civil engineer to help with the restoration of some of its historic buildings there. And I sent in my resume and they took me up on it. So I wound up going for what was initially 2.5 years, but it stretched into 7 years. And then we came back. By that time, we had 2 children. We came back to a little bit more routine life in central New Jersey, working as an engineer. Although at one point I got kind of tired of the particular work that I was doing, so I decided to move into the field of affordable housing. I used my engineering skills to help develop land for low-income housing. And later on, at a later part of my career, when the housing market took a tumble in 2008, I shifted over to solar engineering. So I could use my engineering skills to help solve the climate problem. And I'm proud to say that here in New Jersey, they recently got rid of their last coal-fired power plant, partly because of the efforts of people to install renewable energy. So that's my story in a nutshell.
And why do you think you were moved to respond to these calls? Different opportunities. Why did you choose to take those paths?
Well, I always wanted to do something more than just, have a career for earning money. I'll tell you, when I was in high school, lived in a fairly wealthy suburb. We had, within a half mile, maybe a quarter mile radius, we had 3 men who independently committed suicide. And it made me realize that, this business of generating money and living in a wealthy suburb apparently was not the be all and end all. You had to be doing something that was good for society in addition to earning your livelihood. So I always had that in mind.
That's great. That's so good. Well, I imagine you guys have dropped hints of this, but I want to ask you one last question before we turn it over to Wade. And that is just a simple, first thing that comes to you. What is one thing, if everyone in the world would just do this one thing, it would make the world a better place? Eileen, what's your answer?
Love thy neighbor as thyself, including neighboring cities, countries, all inclusive.
Very nice. Love thy neighbor. And Jay?
Well, I was going to say follow the golden rule, which is essentially the same thing as what Eileen said.
Yeah.
But the golden rule is something that is found in all of the religions. And so, if you are religious at all, regardless of what religion you are, if you follow the golden rule, I think we'll wind up in a much better place.
Very good. Okay, well, with that, we will cut to a commercial break from one of our sponsors and be back with the host of this show, Wade Franson, who will ask some questions and have some great conversation with Eileen and Jay. We'll be right back.
Hello, and welcome to Something or Other Publishing. Call us Soup. Soup is a platform that connects authors, readers, and service providers in one convenient place. Choose Soup if you're an author with a great book idea and you're looking for a publisher offering hands-on coaching in some of the best royalties in the business. Or if you're a reader who enjoys engaging with celebrated and emerging authors. We already have over 3,000 of them, and more are joining every day. You can even win free books by voting on their book ideas. Or maybe you're a service provider and you're looking to engage with over 3,000 authors. We're here to help. So whether you're an author, a reader, or a service provider, you're in the right place at Soup. Contact us at help@soupllc.com to learn more.
Well, Eileen, it's certainly a pleasure to see you here, given that we've just had an advertisement for Something or Other Publishing, one of the sponsors of this show. Do you have a word to say about Something or Other Publishing? Because I know they published your trilogy, which is one of the reasons why you're here on the show tonight.
Yeah, they certainly did. The Coming of the Glory, Volume 1. The Coming of the Glory, Volume 2. And I'm very happy working with Soup. Volume 3 is coming.
We'll be getting into that a little bit more, but that tees up the first question I have to ask of you as we dive into this topic of, can we put Christ back into Christmas? We heard quite a bit about you and Jay and your experiences as Baha'is. And I might share for our audience, we did also invite a couple of other people so that we would have a more well-rounded Christian perspective as well as Jewish on this topic. But we ended up with 2 Baha'is tonight. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we'll dive right now into the core of this question of, can we put Christ back into Christmas? But as viewers of our show know, we like to unpack it in a broad sense. We don't like to go for some, pithy soundbite and sensationalism, but rather explore the topic comprehensively. So Eileen, you mentioned that you've invested your retirement into writing, and I think you've invested like a decade in researching and writing this trilogy, which discusses the Hebrew scriptures, right? The so-called Old Testament. Why, as a Baha'i, would you invest a decade researching and writing about the Hebrew scriptures?
Well, if I had known it was going to be a decade, I might not have started. However, one day after I had come home on retirement, I couldn't find any book about the Hebrew prophets that gave them in chronological order within the flow of Israelite history. And I was frustrated. And a little voice inside me said, okay, write it yourself. And I was given the title, and so I started. And the reason I think it's important is it really matters what the Hebrew prophets say, because God has had a plan from millions of years ago, going back to creation. Well, we won't go back to creation. I'll spare you that. But he has had a plan for the past many thousands of years to educate humankind spiritually. And as Isaiah said, he has known the end from the beginning. And so he has known every step of the way what steps to take. And I think it's important for us, whether we're Christians or Muslims or Baha'is, to realize how unified the world is religiously in the mind of God.
Very, very nice. So as a former minister who spent his life studying the Bible, Old and New Testaments, I was very much aware that there was some confusion about the distinction between Moses and Jesus, and that when Christ came to his people, the Jews, who were living in the area known as Palestine. At this time, it's known as Palestine. It certainly wasn't called Palestine back then. It was, the Holy Land as occupied by the Romans, and the Jews were living there. But they were expecting, most of them, a conquering king, right? And yet Christ then later said he would return, and one would generally understand that it was his return where he would be the conquering king, and that Christians would understand that when he came the first time, he was the suffering Messiah who came as the lamb, the Passover lamb. But for some reason, Jews of that time weren't expecting that kind of a Messiah. And so as we are getting into this topic of Christmas, right, to what degree do these very different views of what a Messiah is that are existent in the Old Testament, so-called Old Testament, how does that play into your research as you're going through these books? And I realize I'm throwing you a curveball now, a question that we hadn't talked about in advance, but it's one that occurred to me as you're talking about the value of those scriptures for understanding the questions that, frankly, they've been plaguing various peoples on the planet for millennia, going back to Jesus at his first coming, who was misunderstood and failed to be recognized, partly because of this distinction between a suffering and a conquering Messiah. And Jesus represents both, but at his first coming, he represented that lamb, that sacrificial lamb.
Well, the short answer is what I discovered is that every single Hebrew prophet foresaw many times the coming of either and or Jesus, Muhammad, and Baha'u'llah. If you figure there are 12 prophets, more if you count the seconds and the thirds, say, of Isaiah, there are maybe 60, 80 prophecies in the Hebrew Bible about the coming of future prophets of God, or messiahs, if you wish to use that word. But never once do they refer to these comings as being militaristic at all. And in fact, one of the reasons Jesus was not recognized is he denied that he was Elijah. And the Jews of that day believed literally what Malachi said, that Elijah would return. Well, it's explained in the Baha'i writings that it was the attributes and the qualities of Elijah that returned. And that puts a whole new spin on it, so to speak.
Fascinating. So getting back to the questions we had prepared. So Jesus came, and the Christian, the world that has become known as the Christian world obviously embraced him. And one of the most recognizable globally traditions associated with Jesus is this celebration of Christmas, right? And we've titled this show Putting Christ Back into Christmas, right? Can we do that? And again, from my own experience, I'll just state this. I'm not going to take the time to unpack this or show research or documentation. Even though when I was a child, and in our religious denomination, we did not celebrate Christmas. And the reason we didn't is we found no evidence that Jesus actually advocated such a celebration. We found no evidence that Jesus was born anywhere near the winter solstice. We found no evidence that there was any benefit to adding ancient traditions to a biblical festival even had Jesus advocated the celebration of his birth, and that it was very clear through doing research that was available even at the time, long, ancient, distant past, before there was an internet. You could find out that Jesus wasn't born at that time, and that many of the traditions, the Christmas tree, the lights, similar to the Easter eggs and whatnot of Easter, that these came from so-called pagan practices. And this was syncretism. This was the mixing of religious beliefs from different peoples, which many passages in the Old Testament are very, very clear that this was forbidden and this was an abomination before Yahweh, right? So we never celebrated Christmas, right? And one of the reasons for calling this show, Can We Put Christ Back into Christmas, is the proposition that you can't put something back in that was never in it in the first place, right? Exactly. I'm not going to unpack all that, because today our audience can just Google, and within seconds they can find the proof that we painstakingly dug out of musty libraries and books back, 40, 50 years ago, before the internet. It's common knowledge for anyone who cares. No, the celebration of Christmas took many elements of a couple of chapters in the Gospels, but the celebration, the time of it, and many of the traditions had nothing to do with anything in the Bible. So I would ask you then, do you feel differently, given your research of the Hebrew Bible? Do these Christmas traditions line up with Jesus, or perhaps more importantly, his message? And, and which ones might line up and which ones might not?
As you said, you can't put Jesus back where he never was in the first place. So the short answer is that you cannot put Jesus Christ back into Christmas. And for most of European and Western history, Christmas wasn't even celebrated as we know it today. Oliver Cromwell certainly didn't permit it. The Puritans didn't permit it. It wasn't until the 19th century that it began to find a place, and it developed from there into what we know and we all agree is very over-commercialized. At the same time, I think it's good that at this time of year, so many people are thinking of other people. That's a positive. And when it comes to putting the Christ back into Christmas, I took kind of a tangential turn. I decided that, well, I didn't just decide, it's true. The word Christ means the Holy Spirit. And I got to thinking we need to put the Holy Spirit into ourselves through prayer and meditation, and into our lives as they affect other people 365 days a year. And of course, Christmas does offer many opportunities to express the Holy Spirit. But why do we limit it to just Christmas?
So this celebration of Christmas globally, would you say it's a net benefit to Christianity and to the message of spirituality, the message of religion, or is it a net detriment at this point? Should people keep it? Is it a good thing?
I can't say what other people should do. I celebrated Christmas with my family long after I became a Baha'i, and we had a lot of fun. I don't celebrate it with other Baha'is. And I can't, say what other Christians or other ministers should do. I think the commercialism that goes into Christmas, the pressures that go into Christmas, especially pressures on people of moderate means, can be crushing, and that's not good. They have social pressure on them to buy, and buy some more. That is not good. I think if people can take a rational, measured, moderate approach to a secular Christmas, that's fine, because you're thinking about other people and you're giving to other people. People have to make their own decisions about Christmas.
Thank you. That's certainly in line with one of the basic premises of our show, which is that religion must never be coercive and it must inspire, right? And that
Yes.
non-coercive nature, the freedom to choose, which is, by the way, very different for, especially if any of my viewers from my former fellowship, where keeping Christmas in any form was a horrible thing to do. And that caused a lot of issues and challenges and problems in relating with the rest of the world, including those closest to you, your family members and whatnot. So, Eileen, thank you for your sharing your real lifetime of wisdom that went into your desire to write about those Hebrew scriptures. We're going to go to a break now, which is actually an ad for your book. Very pleased to show that.
Thank
I want to
you.
encourage everyone listening to check out Eileen's work. Go buy them on Amazon. We'll have an email address at the end of the video, info@soupllc.com or orders@soupllc.com or something like that, so that you can order directly from the publisher. We don't have this fully announced yet, but you can get it at a 30% discount when you mention this show. So just want to make that little plug there as we move to commercial break. Eileen, thank you so much. We're going to have you wait in the studio. We're going to bring Jay on. And once we talk to Jay, we'll all four of us be back. Jill is traveling for Christmas. She was actually up here in Wisconsin, and they're flying back to Florida tonight. So we hope to see Jill back on the show next week. But the four of us, Eileen, Jay, myself, and Jacqueline, will all be back later. But Eileen, thank you so much for sharing, and look forward to talking to you again a little bit later. Thank you so much, Jay, for patiently waiting in the wings. Welcome back.
No problem.
So before we get into a discussion on Christmas with you, we'll share with our audience that Jay is also an author. I think Jacqueline's initial comments were not coming across all that well when we opened the show, and some of the introductory comments come across. But Jay is an author of historical fiction. So Jay, why don't you open by telling our audience a little bit about what motivated you to focus on historical fiction in the context of this show today?
Yes, well, when I was learning about the Baha'i Faith, and particularly what was happening in the world in the 1840s, which is when the Baha'i Faith began, I was aware that here in the West, there was a great movement of anticipation of Christ's return. One of the main figures was a fellow named William Miller, And his teachings later led to the Seventh-day Adventist Church and Jehovah's Witnesses and many other evangelical groups. So there was this great expectation in the 1840s. But later, what I learned was also there was a great expectation going on in the Holy Land among a group of Jewish people who had studied prophecies in the Zohar, which is their book of religious mysticism. They expected their Messiah to appear in the early 1840s. And I also knew that among the Muslims, there was a great expectation of a promised one appearing among them again in the 1840s. And I was trying to think of how to bring these three strands together. And it occurred to me that it might be nice to do it in the form of a novel of a traveler or a couple of travelers who are traveling from the West to the East and learning as they travel in these different lands and to these different places. So since it was a effort of religious exploration and discovery, in the same way that the wise men of the East had moved westward in order to find the promised one of their day, which was Jesus, these travelers are going from the West, heading eastward in order to find the promised one of our day. And so I titled the book, The Wise Men of the West.
Well, I understand you just wrote a blog in the last couple of days that focuses on that specific point in the so-called Christmas story, right? Now, first of all, I should ask, do you agree that Jesus's birth was not around December 25th?
I think that's very likely from what I've read. It's not much evidence that there was, that it happened on December 25th. There's some evidence that it was scheduled at that time to replace one of the Roman traditions, which was also scheduled at the same time or very similar time. So that being the case, I do understand that the celebration of light in the period of darkness, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the celebration of life as in a evergreen tree in the dead of winter, is kind of a statement of the victory of spirituality over the material forces. So in that sense, I kind of appreciate the fact that it happens at this time of year, but historically, I recognize that most likely it did not happen in the middle of winter.
Well, and the different date is not the only aspect of Christmas that is not authentic in that sense, right? Mm-hmm. And in your blog, you actually revealed that there was the possible suppression of an important component about the birth of Christ, that in the Gospel of Matthew, whether it was Matthew's choice or whether it was the choice of some editor or for whatever reason, an aspect that might have been in the original source was removed and suppressed. As strange as that might sound, and I may not be expressing it in the best way, but you wrote a blog that touches on this, and I'd love if you'd unpack that a little bit for our audience, what that was and how it came about.
Yes, exactly. There is something called the Syriac Infancy Gospel, Infancy of Jesus, which is kind of a collection of all the tales that people had about Jesus during his earliest years. Some of them are kind of fanciful, but the tale of the coming of the wise men is included. And in many respects, it's word for word or phrase for phrase identical to what's found in Matthew. So I don't know whether, Matthew copied it from the person who wrote the Syriac Infancy Gospel or the other way around. But one line in particular in Matthew reads, "Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." In the Syriac Infancy Gospel, it says, "The wise men came from the east to Jerusalem." But in the Syriac Gospel, it's followed by the phrase, according to the prophecy of Zaradasht, which is another name for Zoroaster. And it is clear, it would be clear to anyone in that time, that the Magi, the wise men, were Zoroastrian. Persia was the giant empire to the east of the Holy Land. And Magi was the word to describing the educated class, the religious educated class of the Zoroastrians. So it was very clear that there was some connection to the Zoroastrian religion. And if you ask yourself, what would motivate a group of people, they don't know for sure that it was three, but some people, to travel something like 1,200 miles from their homeland to a foreign country in search of a promised one. And to I think the thinking of almost everybody, there has to be, it's not just out of a sense of curiosity. It's not just that they had some extra gold and incense and myrrh to give away. They had a strong religious motivation, and that came from their own religion, a prophecy of Zoroaster. And if you go back to Zoroastrian writings, which we've been able to do more recently, you find out that he spoke of another prophet would come after about 1,000 years. And sure enough, Zoroaster lived about 1,000 years before Jesus. They don't know exactly when, but it's about 1,000 years. So it's certainly very plausible that the Zoroastrians were, because of Zoroaster's prophecy, they were expecting another messenger of God. And they see this sign, which Zoroaster very well might have described a sign in the heavens, a conjunction or a comet or something like that. And so they follow it. So there is I think, a very strong case for a prophetic connection between the Zoroastrian religion and the first chapter of Matthew. Now, the other question.
When we start talking about prophecy, students of the Bible know that the weave of prophecy is staggering in its magnitude. So one thread that comes to mind in this context is the birth of Jesus was in the context of a pogrom against Jewish boy babies, right? And this is inherent in the wise men and the route they took as described by Daniel, and not visiting Herod on their way back because they'd been warned, and Herod trying to find out, why are you here? Where are you? And Herod killing boy babies because of also these prophetic ideas that a king of the Jews was being born. And of course, this goes back to the story of Israel in Egypt and the death angel that came and took the firstborn of the Egyptians. And the Hebrews were supposed to take a lamb, keep that lamb, slaughter that lamb on a specific day, and with the blood of that lamb strike the doorposts of their house to protect themselves from that very situation of the death angel coming and taking their firstborn. And as the story goes, they were then protected and they left Egypt with a high hand. So all of that is a weave of prophecy that then leads to Daniel. And you're saying there were other prophecies from the Zoroastrian religion, which is, of course, fascinating. But I want to highlight, as you mentioned, that Zoroaster came about 1,000 years before Christ, which places him after Moses, right?
Yes.
But before Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I bring this up is Daniel was another prophet. His book is in the writings portion. One doesn't sometimes think of him as a prophet, but his prophecies are less the sort of Nazarite, long hair, not drinking wine, railing in the desert about the evils and the sins of the people and the calamities that would come, sort of the John the apostle, apocalypse, revelation kind of prophecy. Daniel's prophecies were very specific and lead to dates about about Jesus coming and his return. And as I've pointed out elsewhere, the book of Daniel documents all this, but Daniel himself, when he sought an answer from God, what does all this mean? You've told me to write this down and I don't even understand it. And God tells Daniel, look, Daniel, the book is sealed. Go thy way. It is sealed until the time of the end. Many will go to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. But none will understand except until the time of the end. This book will be unsealed, and then the wise will understand. To me, this evokes those wise men understanding and discerning and knowing. And I've posited that because where was Daniel? Daniel was, in fact, under Nebuchadnezzar. Wasn't Nebuchadnezzar an emperor in the Persian Empire?
Yeah, the Persian Empire had taken over the Babylonian Empire, so he definitely became a part of the Persian Empire. And yeah, it's fascinating. Daniel speaks in chapter 9 about a prophecy of the cutting off of the Messiah in 490 days, which are understood as years. And it's very possible that the Magi of Jesus's time were looking at the prophecy of Zoroaster and the prophecy of Daniel and noticing that the times converged. And so it's very
because
possible.
Daniel upstaged those their ancestors, the Magi at the court of Nebuchadnezzar, who were brought in to interpret these dreams that Nebuchadnezzar was having. And he said, hey, I'm not telling you what I dreamt, because I know how that game is played. I'll tell you and you'll make something up. I got your number. No, you tell me what I dreamt and what it means. And they said, oh, king, nobody can do this. And Daniel waltzes in and upstages them by saying, no, you're right, nobody can, but there's a God in heaven, and he reveals this to his servants, the prophets, of which Daniel obviously was one, and these guys were not at that time. And so, yeah, there's a cross-pollination there that is fascinating, and that brings so much more richness and meaning to the story as recorded in the Bible. And one of my contentions, if you will, with Christmas is all of that is hidden and lost in the trappings and the commercialism and the, not necessarily wrong or evil in some senses, but it's layers upon layers upon layers of tradition that hide the true meaning.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think the weave with Daniel coming in is particularly important, because when the wise men came, they came asking for the one who is born king of the Jews. They weren't looking for the king of the Zoroastrians or the king of the Persians. They had in fact left their homeland in order to find Jesus, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. They could realize that this promised one that Zoroaster had promised was actually not going to come from Persia. And so they set out and looking, traveling all the way westward to to Jerusalem at first, and then down to Bethlehem. And so the fact that they were looking in the Jewish Holy Land suggests to me that they had picked up on some of the writings of either Daniel or other Old Testament prophets that filtered in, and they were able to see the big picture. They were able to step back and say, wait a minute, we don't have to think in terms of the fulfillment of the prophecies of Zoroaster or Daniel. It could be both Zoroaster and Daniel, that these two prophecies are converging on a single point.
Well, we'll pick up on that in a couple of minutes. I had one more question for you, but I'm actually going to save it for when we bring Eileen and Jacqueline back on, because I think it's more of a roundtable question. So, Jay, thank you so much for unpacking some of this detail. And
if I could just add, if
please.
You want some more on this particular topic, wisemenofthewest.com is my blog, all one word, Wise Men of the West. Just go there and you'll see more details under blog number 18.
Wonderful. And we're going to cut to a commercial break, which, for the benefit of everyone, I'll just show one more comment here from the chat here from Ralph Shoemaker. Thank you for sharing these critical dates for Zoroastrians. I've actually had the pleasure of meeting now 3 Zoroastrians, each one with a slightly different take. We've had actually one of them in our home when we were in California. One of in our home in Madison, one of our home now here in Brooklyn, Wisconsin, and most recently one from Germany that I met on a discussion group with our co-host Jacqueline Clare. So fascinating perspectives that come from that direction. We'll have a little bit more about on that, but we're going to cut to a commercial break. Jay Tyson is also an author with Something or Other Publishing, so there's a dual plug for the publishing company and for Jay's work, which in this commercial break, we have another video we'll show you, and then we'll be right back for a roundtable wrap-up. So Jay, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And as I mentioned, we'll be right back with you here very shortly.
Appreciate the opportunity to answer some questions.
And I'll just mention that both of those books by Eileen and Jay are now published. I think those book trailers were created during a pre-order phase with the publisher. I'm going to go ahead and share the email address you're going to want to use, info@soupllc.com. Send your request and mention the show and get a 30% discount on any of Eileen's books or Jay's books. And I want to just show deep appreciation for these two guests who have spent decades of their life studying into these matters. There's so much more in their books. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Jacqueline. I want to throw the question out there. We asked earlier if you could have one thing that everybody would do to change the world. What would that one thing be? That's, world peace, right? But let's narrow it down. If there were one thing you could invite people to change about Christmas, to move in the direction of putting Christ back into Christmas, even though in one sense he wasn't in it, right? As I somewhat jokingly say, because of all the traditions, all the trappings, getting the date wrong, and perhaps most importantly, in my read of the Bible, and this is just my personal opinion, Jesus emphasized that we should celebrate his death, right? His sacrifice, not that we should celebrate his birth. And during the time, one of the reasons why it's very unlikely that perhaps one reason why we don't know the date, why we don't know the exact date of Christ, indicating he didn't want us to keep it, is that celebrating one's birth was not something that was done in the Jewish religion at that time. And there are indications that there were negative connotations to celebrating the day of one's birth. And there are scriptures, Proverbs, Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, that says the day of one's parting is better than the day of one's birth, right? And so for all these reasons, I somewhat jokingly say, well, you can't put Christ back in when he was never there in the first place. But, if we're going to celebrate Christmas, what should people consider? What would be one thing that you would recommend people change or do differently to improve the Christmas celebration next year? And for our audience, we purposefully did not air this topic before Christmas because we're not a Scrooge. We're not wanting to be the Grinch. We're not going to cause a problem within a family of convincing someone to not keep Christmas the week before Christmas. Kind of ridiculous, right? But now that it's over, and maybe some people have a little bit of a Christmas hangover, what would you do differently in celebrating Christmas next year? Eileen, let's go to you first.
Oh dear. Well, I haven't celebrated Christmas for many years now because I don't have family in this area. But for those who get together with families, perhaps I could suggest a round of prayers before the Christmas dinner. And I don't mean just the head of the family giving a prayer according to his or her own religious tradition, but everybody either give a prayer or share a very kind thought with everybody. Let the Holy Spirit flow.
Invite God or Jesus right then and there back into Christmas through the power of prayer. That's a good one. Jay, what about you?
So I would like to see everybody recognize that the reason that the wise men came, at least one of the main reasons that the wise men came, was because they were seeking the fulfillment of a prophecy of Zoroaster. And the fact that Zoroaster was able to accurately predict the coming of God's next messenger 1,000 years before the event seems to me clear evidence that he was a true prophet. So, in America, we tend to speak of the Judeo-Christian culture. I think we should, at the very least, include the Zoroastrians as part of our religious heritage because of this clear connection. And thus we can celebrate religion. We can celebrate the coming of Jesus. At the same time, we're celebrating not only we can celebrate it with the Zoroastrian prophecy, as well as Hanukkah among the Jews. The Hindus also celebrate Diwali, a feast of lights, at this time of year. We can see it as a part of the existence of spirituality in the dark age that we're in the middle of at this dark time of the year. Apologies, of course, to those in the Southern Hemisphere who have this going on at the light time of the year, but I think the larger part of the world's population is in the Northern Hemisphere and experiences the darkness at this time of year. So it's a good time to be celebrating spirituality in its many different flavors.
Thank you, Jay. Jacqueline, you've been watching in the wings through most of the interview with Jay and Eileen about Christmas. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I love these answers. I think, of course, minimizing the gifts and also reflecting on what the purpose of those are for you and your family, like the symbolism of the gift of life or the gift of the messengers and Christ and Zoroaster and all of that. And I think that the simplicity of Eileen's answer, bringing prayer and scripture into gatherings is always a good way to ground it in spiritual reality.
Thank you. And for those who would like to check out Eileen's website, we've posted the link there, eileenmaddocks.com. So I'm going to now give my answer to that, but I'm going to give a very specific answer to the tens of thousands of people who I ministered to when I was a minister in the Worldwide Church of God. And we had these annual festivals in the fall, 8-day festivals that really stemmed from the Jewish holiday cycle of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, and what we call the last great day, which is the 8th day, which in the New Testament you might recall that Jesus stood up on the last day, that great day, and proclaimed that he was offering rivers of living waters to all who listened. That was the 8th day of the festival, at the end of Sukkot. And during that time, I spoke, frankly, all around the world, sometimes to audiences of many thousands of people who believed, as I did at the time, that, it would be an abomination to celebrate Christmas and to participate in these pagan rituals. I would submit that what I've come to understand, based on what you said, Jay, about the Zoroastrian connection, that the Tower of Babel, which is part of the source of that, and I've spoken a lot about the Tower of Babel, or Bab-el, the city of Bab-el, which Nimrod founded, and those of us in that denomination, some of whom are listening tonight, would decry what Nimrod did, and God called it confusion, Babel, which is the core of Babylon, who conquered Israel, and later Babylon the Great, that evil entity in the end time book of Revelation that wreaks havoc across the planet, right? So you have that negative aspect of what Nimrod was trying to do, to set up a counterfeit to the true plan of God. And that's how we viewed all the trappings around Christmas, a counterfeit that hid the meaning. But there's another way to look at that. And I can unpack this perhaps on a future show, or engage with anyone who's really concerned about this. When God, according to that story, came down and confused the languages, stopping the work, destroying the unity that existed under Nimrod, where they were all one and they all had one language and they were united in their purpose. And God destroyed that, according to the story, by making it impossible for them to communicate with each other, and they scattered across the earth. So God said, similar to in the days of Noah and the flood story, that what man was up to was not good. And the outcome of the power of that unity was ultimately negative. But we see, when we talk about Christ coming, and at his first coming, he said, I come to bring a sword. I don't come to bring peace, but I come to bring a sword, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. And indeed, that was true for, Christianity coming and shaking things up. And Christianity had to distance itself from Judaism. And it did so, in my opinion, to a very unhealthy degree, when an opposition was set up and Judaizers were put to death by the early church. And all this division and the horror came about as a result of that. But ultimately, we know that Jesus' return is to bring about 1,000 years of peace and unity. And the symbol is the soldier beating his sword into a plowshare, which is the symbol for the United Nations. And I'm not here to promote everything about the current iteration of the United Nations and the corruption that's frankly going on within that entity, as it is within much of the world. But this move towards unity is something that God ultimately does want. And the separation of these things into different languages, and the separation of these prophecies between the Zoroastrians and the Jews and the Christians. And as Jay pointed out, ultimately these threads come back together at certain key times. And Eileen, you've written a book about 1844 in which you also bring in the Islamic prophecies about the 1260 years, and how these also point to 1844. So what I now see that is different from what I saw 20, 30 years ago is that in the same way that God separated the languages out at the Tower of Babel, because humankind was not ready, was not mature enough, and the time was not right for the return of Jesus to bring everybody back together. Nonetheless, there comes a time in human history where those forces do bring humanity back together, and those seeds are planted even at the divine spiritual level in the form of prophecies, which help lead people like those wise men, 1,200 and some miles, you said it was, Jay, that they somehow on their camels, I mean, how long did that take? How many months did that take, right? And some of it was not pleasant traveling in the winter, or even in the fall, or whenever it was, right? Whenever it was at that time, traveling 1,200 miles by camel or whatever they traveled on was not always pleasant, right? but they went to that effort to come and worship a king that was being born to a different nation, to a different empire. I'm also reminded, Eileen, of the prophet Jonah, right? Who didn't want to go and preach to Nineveh because he knew they would repent. He knew God would forgive them, and he knew they would then come and conquer Israel. But he did it in submission to the will of God, preaching repentance to a people who would later destroy his own people, right? So God has cross-pollinated around the planet the seeds that will eventually bring us back together. And so, whereas at one time I would have stayed a million miles away from Christmas, today I can see the ability, as Jay, you pointed out, all these festivals of light bringing people back together in a similar time. And, I view the lion and the lamb in the prophecies of Isaiah as, the Jewish faith, right? The Lion of Judah, as prophesied in Genesis 49, and the Lamb of Christ, these religions coming back together. And largely speaking, in the Holy Land today, you have the unity of the lion and the lamb laying down together. The wolf, maybe not quite so much. And the snake that the child will be able to grab and not be harmed, maybe not so much. The snake in the grass, the evil whisperings, they're still there. But ultimately, the lion and the lamb and the wolf do come together, and the little child will lead them, and he will grab the snake and it won't harm him, right? This peace is one of the aspects that we can actually see, perhaps dimly, through all the diverse trappings and all the commercialism. We can dimly see that in this celebration of Christmas. So I would leave that with those of my friends who, like I was decades ago, might still be incredibly averse to any aspect of Christmas. Those are my closing thoughts. Jay, Eileen, Jacqueline, anything to add to that on the topic of Christmas before we just announce what we'll be talking about next week?
I think it was very enlightening to see different points of view.
Yeah, Wade, I think that was a good summary. We have, we're learning more points of view as we go, as we get exposed to people of other faith backgrounds. We learn their perspectives, and there are ways to work things out.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Yes. And I would say opportunities, whatever excuse to get together with family and loved ones and sit across a table and have conversation are always really important.
Mm-hmm. And Jacqueline, you also do conduct, I think, at least once a month, maybe more often, discussion groups on spiritual topics. Perhaps you want to say a word about that if anyone would like to reach out and join you for that.
Sure. I have a podcast called Spiritual Conversation, and it is an outgrowth of that podcast where I invite people to a Zoom session that's not recorded, but just people who have responded to different themes of the podcast to get together and get to share their thoughts and actually make it a conversation. So if anyone is interested in being involved in that, there's several ways you can find me. The best way to contact me is through my website, which is jacquelineclaireart.com/contact, and check out Spiritual Conversation on YouTube or on any podcast platform.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I just shared a couple of comments there at the end, which I'll just spend a moment unpacking. For rabbit, interestingly, didn't understand all the animal references. Sorry, rabbit. I'd like to understand a little bit more about why rabbit. But anyway, I'm just joking with you. I do appreciate that. I was referring to a particular prophecy in Isaiah 11. I think it's verse 16, where it's prophesied that the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the lion will eat straw like an ox. There are several versions of this. There's also one where there's a wolf. and a lamb. And in Genesis chapter 49, you've got these prophecies about the tribes of Israel and Judah, which is symbolic largely of the Jews. The Jews, a reference to the tribe of Judah, is represented as a lion, right? And the lamb, obviously, Jesus is represented as a lamb. So you could have Christianity being the lamb, you could have the lion being Judah. So Rabbit added the comment about it being the wolf and the lamb. Yes, there's another version where it's the lion. So there are multiple references to this. So hopefully that was it. And I'm sorry for confusing you. We can dive into that more deeply at another time. But those are interesting prophecies to imagine a time when, like that symbolic lion and lamb and wolf laying down together, these religions also make peace with each other, because there have been wars fought in the name of religion, as we know. There are those who might ascribe the wolf to being Islam, is one other thought. I'm not saying that this is definitive. So anyway, thank you, Rabbit, for that. We might be able to dive into that more deeply at a future time. But next week, for those of you who want to tune in, we're going to be taking on the topic of New Year's resolutions, right? New Year's resolutions. And those, love your neighbor as yourself, or raising a glass and toasting world peace at New Year's. We're gonna ask the question about whether New Year's resolutions work, whether they are effective in transforming ourselves or the world. We're going to tie that into the theme of this show, which is created in the image of God, the role of religion in society. We're going to begin moving the show in the direction of understanding personal responsibility. We'll continue to talk about the big picture, about what role religion as a whole plays in society. We'll talk about some of the big ideas that are being contested in the marketplace of ideas in this nation, in other nations around the world, how religion is being encouraged, how it's being discouraged, and how that should all play out. We've got a future show about the freedom of religion, and whether in this nation our Constitution advocates freedom of religion or freedom from religion. So we won't avoid those big topics, but we're going to increasingly try to talk about what can you do about it personally. What changes can you make in your own life in service of your faith, in service of your commitment, in service of your sense of personal responsibility? And we're going to sort of kick off a move in that direction by talking about New Year's resolutions next week. So we look forward to having you back next week on Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson, here with co-host Jacqueline Clare, and very grateful to Jay and Eileen. Once again, email us at info@soupllc.com to get a 30% discount off of any of their books. And we'll see you all again next week.
Thanks.